Your introductory remarks reminded me of something, and I think it was a pretty chilling statistics you gave. 700 STEM majors who leave their concentration, their major, every week. Now, I almost dropped out. I was educated in Europe, and I wasn't planning on saying this, but your remarks sort of triggered that memory. I knew from a very young age that I wanted to do astronomy. When I was something like 5 or 6 years old, my grandfather gave me a book about astronomy, and I literally fell in love with the heavens, the mysteries of the universe. So I enrolled at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, which at that time was a very well-established institution to do astronomy, to enroll as an astronomy major. It took no more than 6 weeks or so for me to be completely disillusioned. Instead of talking about the big picture, it was all about right ascensions, declinations, putting numbers into formulas. I decided that astronomy was not for me. So I switched my major to physics because I knew I'd done pretty well in physics in high school, only to discover within a few weeks that physics wasn't actually much better than astronomy. But I already switched once, so I decided to hang on. It was in graduate school when I started to do research again that the desire to learn and the intrinsic motivation to learn, in a sense, returned, which is kind of a sad story, but I think that probably many of you can relate to that. I changed the title to my talk a little bit because I realized that in order to educate the innovators of the 21st century, we have to start by innovating education. I mean, education is steeped in medieval traditions. In fact, we wear these funny robes at graduation, I think, to remind ourselves of that fact. When I started teaching at Harvard some 32 years or so ago, I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? It was completely clear what I was going to do. I was going to do to my students, this is actually a picture of me when I was still an assistant professor at Harvard, I was going to do to my students what my instructors had done to me, lecture. This was not to take revenge or anything. I think we all tend to do that. We tend to project our own experiences onto the world around us. And I naively thought that I had learned physics sitting in a room like that, listening to my professor, so I just started to lecture. In retrospect, it's kind of strange that you take on a new responsibility without asking yourself how you're going to do it. But I think that tends to happen a lot in education. Now, interestingly enough, what happened was that very quickly, my assumption was reinforced. I got signs that I was doing the right thing. You see, my colleagues at Harvard had asked me to teach the course that none of them wanted to teach, physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. They just had to. In a sense, that it was a captive audience. They had to do it in order to meet their concentration requirements. Most of them didn't want to teach that course because they would get terrible ratings at the end of the semester and come close to committing suicide. But not so for me. I got a 4.5, 4.8 on a 5-point scale. And that was not the only feedback. I could give my students some problems that I wasn't sure I would do well on under the pressure of an exam. But by and large, my students did well. So, in short, they liked me as an instructor. They did well on what I considered a difficult exam. Very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. Very pleasant illusion. It turned out to be a complete illusion. By the way, I forgot to point out, I did what my teachers had done to me. I'm sure that they did to me what their teachers had done to them. All the way back to this guy here that you see here. This actually is an illustration from an illuminated manuscript from the early 14th century, showing Henry from Germany giving a guest lecture in Bologna in the 12th century. Do you see the similarity to that picture that I just showed to you? By the way, the picture I just showed to you is a very old picture. It was taken BC, before computers. I'm using an overhead projector, as you can see. But notice the incredible similarity. You know, of course, we don't wear these robes anymore while we teach, only at graduation, but there are some details in this picture which are just uncanny, like... So let's get back for a moment to this picture. I want you, and you're just going to have to blurt it out so I can hear it here, to tell me what is happening there on the screen behind me. And ideally, I'd like you to, don't give whole speeches, just one or two words. And ideally, I'd like you to use a verb. But there are two verbs I do not want to hear: teaching and learning. So what is it that is happening there on the screen? Go ahead, blurt it out. Passive. Transcription. Boring? I just told you this was my class. Telling. Professing. Listening. Come on, come on. I know it's the end of the day, but sitting. Unengaging, thank you. You're very kind. Sleeping? Did somebody say sleeping there? You know, that reminds me of a quote I once read, which was attributed to Albert Camus, although I think the attribution is not correct. He once said, or he's supposed to have once said, "Some people talk in their sleep. Lecturers talk well while other people are sleeping." But, you know, this is my class, and you can sort of see the students are sitting up, they're not sleeping. Notice that most of the verbs that we heard pertain either to them or to me. Talking, I'm talking, they're not talking. Listening, they're listening, I'm not listening. Sleeping, well, maybe they're sleeping, I can't afford to be sleeping in front of the class. We're both there at the same time, in the same space. I would like to hear something that encompasses both them and me. Transferring. Transferring what? I hear knowledge, but you know, can we really transfer knowledge? It would be great if we could transfer knowledge. Ideally, I'd like to transfer that knowledge while people are sleeping. But frankly, I think knowledge is not something that can be transferred. Knowledge is something that needs to be constructed in the brains of the learner. So I like the transferring part. I don't like the knowledge. So what is it that is being transferred? Information. Lectures focus on the transfer of information. And you know what? My students had actually pointed that out. They'd rubbed that in my face very early on in my teaching career, and I had ignored it. I just completely ignored it. See, I just told you that I never asked myself how I was going to teach. There were questions coming up in my mind. What do you think was one of them? Not how, but what? So I went to a colleague who had taught the course before, and he said, oh, in this course, in the past, we've used the book by Halliday and Resnick. If there are people who took physics courses here a long time ago, you may know the book. It's still being used, believe it or not. I was also told by my colleague that I had to make sure that the bookstores had enough copies of the book in stock, which to me was very odd. You know, in Europe, where I came from, in the Netherlands, you would never get it into your head to buy a textbook. Why buy the textbook if the professor is presenting the contents of the textbook to you? Anyway, he told me that I had to do this, so a month before the semester started, I went over to the Harvard Coop and our bookstore in Harvard Square, and I said, be sure that by September 15th, you have 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick in stock. And as I was walking back to my office, I thought, wait a minute. If the students have the book and I have the same book, then what do I do in the classroom? So I went back to my colleague and I knocked on his door and I asked him that question. And he said, oh, Eric, don't worry. There are lots of different physics textbooks. And he showed me a shelf full of books that he had collected. And I started looking, and very quickly I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. The first reason was it was different from Helen Resnick, so I was not just regurgitating the content of the book that the students had bought. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was the book was out of print. So before every lecture, I spent countless hours, 10 or so, preparing lecture notes, which in class I would project on the overhead projector. I would write them on the board behind me. And because my notes were different from the textbook, I said to myself, it'd be good if the students had a copy of my lecture notes. So at the end of each class, remember this was BC, right? So there was no way of posting the notes. At the end of each class, as the students walked out of the classroom, they could pick up a photocopied set of notes. Now, why do you think that I hand them out at the end of class and not the beginning of class? So they'd stay and listen to me. But isn't that already admitting that there's a problem? Why force the students to get the information out of my mouth if they could get it from the notes? Never came up in my mind. But you know what happened? What happened was that at the end of that first year, about half a dozen students wrote in the comment section at the bottom of the end of semester evaluation, Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I handed out to them? These are ungrateful students. But you know, the students had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. And if they had read the book, they would have seen that the book wasn't that different from my lecture notes. Now, that scene that I've just described, which applies equally well to Henry of Germany and myself, is actually replicated around the world everywhere. On your campuses, on my campus, on campuses in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, everywhere. So you could well ask yourself the question, is that what education is? Is education merely the transfer of information? I mean, it's not a crazy question, because if you were to come from an exoplanet and visit planet Earth and you study sort of the education habits of Homo sapiens, that's what you would well be led to conclude. So let me ask the question of you. We don't have clickers, so we're going to use makeup clickers, hands. I'm going to ask you a multiple choice question, and then you're going to have to make a choice, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and put a hand on your chest when I count to 3, 1, 2, 3, indicating your choice. Instructions clear? If you do not put your hand on your chest when I count to 3, I'm going to come down the stage, put this microphone right in front of you, and you're going to have to tell the whole room what your choice is. I tell that to my students too, and then immediately they, you know. Here's the question. Is education just the transfer of information? 1, yes. 2, no. Education is more than just the transfer of education. Okay, so here, at the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. Go ahead. 3? There's no 3. Okay, keep it there. Why don't you all raise your hands? Don't change what you indicate. Okay, look around for a moment. Overwhelming majority of 2s, a few 1s. I have a warning to those of you who answered 1. You're about to lose your job. Because let's face it, if education were just the transfer of information, what would be the logical thing to do in the 21st century? Buy a smartphone. But before they buy a smartphone, what do we need to do? Record it. Put it on. In fact, it's already happening. Record every single lecture in every language and every discipline and put it on the internet. Because that's a pretty good way of transferring information. What would we lose if we took all of our courses and put them online and then, no longer hold live classes. Of course, we'd lose our jobs, but, other than our jobs, what would we lose? Interaction. But how much interaction is there really in a classroom? I'm working very hard on interacting with you. It's not easy. It's not easy because you came here with the mindset, I'm going to listen to Eric Mazur, not I'm going to interact. And most of our students bring that same mindset to their classrooms. And I make a habit whenever I visit a campus, I do that on my own campus too, to observe classes. I go to large psychology classes taught by my colleagues. Some are fantastic lecturers, and you see the same scene. Person lecturing at the front of the room, dynamic, maybe engaging, and then after 7 minutes, the person pauses and says, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And the students look down, they don't want to make eye contact. And if the lecturer waits long enough, it's always the same person in the front row who reluctantly asks a question. So I think we would lose precious little interaction. And in part it is due to the architecture of our learning spaces. Who is responsible for that architecture? The architect, very good. But the architect got it from somewhere else. The ancient Greek, exactly. Now, why did the ancient Greek develop the amphitheater? For what purpose? Theater, so that everybody could see and everybody could hear. Did the ancient Greek actually use the amphitheater as a learning space? No. If you look at an illustration of the School of Athens, you'll see people walk and talk and discuss. So the Greek were smart enough not to use the performance space as a learning space. Imagine this had not been arranged with round tables, but with rows of chairs like that. The mindset you bring in, and probably you came in with that mindset, was to sit down and listen and observe. The same as when you go to a movie or a play or anything else given in a space like that. It discourages interaction. So I think if education were just a transfer of information, then we are doomed, because there are better ways of transferring information. Now, I was happy to see that probably 99% of you had two. So I'm going to switch now from the yeses to the no. What more than just transfer of information, is education? Problem solving, critical thinking, inspiration. I would actually argue that you could get inspiration from watching a lecture. In fact, I've watched quite a few TED lectures that I found extremely inspiring, probably more inspiring than many of the lectures I've had, all of the lectures I've had as a student. So I think inspiration you could still get in the information transfer stage. So what else? Interaction, yes. Understanding, but what does understanding exactly mean? Feedback and revision. I would say it's not enough just to open your skull, put the information in, hold it there long enough to regurgitate on the exam. The learner has to do something with that information. Extract from the information the mental models, the knowledge, if you want, that permits you to apply what you've learned in a new context, in a context that you've not seen before. Unfortunately, I think we barely get there, and mostly it's instructors delivering information to the audience, and then the students retaining the information long enough to regurgitate it back on the exam. You know, there's actually an advantage of recording a lecture. We'll talk about that later in the second part of my talk. Because you see, when you're listening to a lecture, in a sense, your mind is held captive by the speaker. You're listening to me now. If I keep talking and your mind wanders, you think, I got to think about what Eric just said there. You're no longer listening, because you either listen or you think. Your mind wanders. Now, as a student, you know that if your mind wanders, you might be missing valuable information. So you suppress the tendency to think. You may scribble down a note and say, I'll think about this later. So I think if education were just a transfer of information, then we're in trouble. And the key really is for the students to, Piaget would have called it accommodate the information. I'd say maybe assimilate that information so that we can construct the knowledge in our brains that are going to make us, innovative STEM graduates. Where did that happen for you and for me? I've often asked myself. In a sense, I see education now as a two-step process. First one is information transfer, right? Because if there's no information transfer, then, there's no education. But that's not sufficient. You need that second step, the aha moment. Oh, I get it. I've often asked myself, where did that happen for me? Where did it happen for you? Did it happen while you were sitting in a room like that, listening to your professors? I see many people shake no. So where did it happen? Working with peers. It happened outside of the classroom. So it's kind of ironic that the dominant educational approach, used probably in 99% of classrooms around the world, focus on that first step, which I would say is easy, and leaves the hard part to the students. Now, it worked for us. It worked for you. It worked for me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten to the positions that we are in. But we became professors. Our students are not going to be professors or academics. In fact, if they all became academics, then the world would very quickly be covered with academics. I'm not sure that would be a good thing. So I decided that I should focus on the hard part and not the easy part. I'll tell you briefly how I discovered that how I tumbled, in a sense, out of this ivory tower. For 7 years or so, I happily lectured, getting this feedback, thinking that my students learned and were happy about my lecturing. But then I came across an instrument that tests students' understanding of the concept of force. By the way, this talk is not about physics, but I just want to tell you what happened to me and what opened my eyes, so to speak. This was a test that was developed at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. A professor by the name of David Hestenes developed a set of 29 questions that, using words only, no equation, test students' understanding of the concept of force, which is the most basic concept in a physics course. If you don't understand force, you cannot understand momentum, energy, work. I mean, the whole scaffold of physics collapses. Now, most of the students who came to my class at Harvard had gotten a 5 on the AP. So they'd already had an advanced physics course. And therefore, I spent very little time talking about force, launching immediately into more complex material. Anyway, that professor claimed that it didn't make much difference whether you asked these questions at the beginning of the semester or the end of the semester. And that most of the students would, essentially show a total lack of understanding of Newton's laws. Let me give you an example. A heavy truck and a light car collide head-on the highway. Is the force exerted by the heavy truck on the light car, A, larger than the force exerted by the light car on the heavy truck? B, the two are equal in magnitude to each other. C, the light car exerts a larger force on the heavy truck in the collision than the other way around. Now, all students in an introductory physics course can recite Newton's third law. You may have heard of it. Action is reaction. Or the force exerted by object 1 on object 2 is equal in magnitude to the force exerted by object 2 on object 1. In equation, F12 is F21. Now, according to Hestenes, something absolutely peculiar happens when you replace 1 by heavy truck and 2 by light car. I read that and I thought, no way, not my students, not Harvard students. But you see, I'm a scientist, so I've learned not to jump to conclusions. So I thought, I'm going to show that in my class at Harvard, they aced this quiz, this test. It was already close to the end of the semester. We were dealing with much more complicated materials. Well, it took no more than 5 minutes for me to tumble out of my ivory tower, because hardly at the start of one student raised her hand, and I walked over to her, and she looks at me, and she asks, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way I usually think about these things? You're laughing. I don't think that's funny at all. Anyway, so that's when I sort of had this eye-opening moment, and I thought, I'm not the best physics teacher after all. In fact, I'm probably one of the worst physics teachers. And in a sense, I started to think then that, yeah, I was focusing on this first step, and that second step wasn't happening in my classroom. And I thought what I should really do is throw that first step out of the classroom, make the students respond. Let's have them just read the notes before coming to class. So then the question is, what do you do in the classroom if the students have read the material before class? And the answer to that is actually very simple and nothing new. Teach by questioning rather than by telling. Who said that first? Not Aristotle, but you're close. Socrates, exactly. They were back at the ancient Greek. It's not that I thought Socrates, let's apply Socrates. No, not at all. It was a completely serendipitous discovery. You see, after I'd given this test to my students, not only was I shocked, they were shocked too. It was only 2 weeks till the final exam. They couldn't understand why they had scored so low. So they asked me for a special session where it goes through every single question on this test. So I booked one of our large lecture halls, 250 students I had at that time, and I went through every single question on this test. And when I got to the truck and the car question, I thought, that's simple, Newton's third law. So I turned my back to them. I made a drawing of the truck on one side of the board, car the other. I drew the forces of gravity on each, the force of the road up, and then I drew the force of the truck on the car on the truck, and I turned around, and I said, by Newton's third law, these two forces are the same. What more is there to explain about it, right? And I could see from their faces that they were confused. So I said, is there a question? They were so confused they couldn't articulate a question, or at least not a coherent question. So I thought, this is serious. This was the first week of class. So I raised the board, and I thought, maybe they're confused that the forces are the same, but the effects are different. But that's simply because the truck is so heavy. So I should bring in Newton's second law, F equals ma. Anyway, I erased the board, and in the next 8 minutes, I managed to produce the most brilliant explanation you could possibly imagine. I mean, the entire board was covered with drawings and equations. Of course, I'd done it all with my back to them. And I turned around. I was, beaming. I'd sort of nailed this whole issue, only to see that they looked even more confused. And they could still not articulate any question. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what to do. However, I knew that half of them had given the right answers on the quiz. So in a moment of despair, I said to them, why don't you just discuss it with each other? And something happened that I'd never seen in my classroom. Complete, utter chaos. They all started talking to each other. I mean, they forgot about me in front of the class. I could have walked away. They would not have noticed it. But what was even more surprising was that in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I thought, how can this be? I, the expert, tried in 2 different ways to explain to them 10 minutes unsuccessfully, and they just talked to each other for 2 minutes and figured it out? Now let's imagine you have 2 students sitting next to each other, John and Mary. Mary understands it, has the right answer. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. Won't always work, but on average, it's going to go in that direction. But that's not the important point. Here's the important point. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned. She still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, to him it's so clear that he cannot even understand why somebody doesn't get it. It's what my colleague Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. So I thought, wow, that's amazing. I should really teach this way. So I decided that what I was going to do is have them read the information before class, and in class I would just ask them a question. Ask a question, have them think, commit to an answer. That gave rise to the clickers. Some of you may have heard of clickers that began in my classroom in '93. And then, I tell them, turn to a neighbor and try to find a neighbor who has a different answer. You're going to have to do the same thing in a minute when we try it out. So if you turn to your right, and the person on your right has the same answer, don't start talking to that person. You already agree. Turn to your left. If that person also agrees, get up, walk around. Your task is to find somebody who disagrees. If between 30 and 70% have the desired answer before people launch in this discussion, you can see huge gains. Below 30%, there are simply not enough people to transfer the right way of thinking, and above 70%, it's hard to find somebody who disagrees. So, people are not going to find something to talk about, and they'll go off task. So typically, between 30 and 70% initially yields very large gains. You can actually see the students go, oh, you can see the aha moment in front of you. So, and that cycle basically repeats until my class time is up. Do you want to try it? Now, I know you only recently joined the conference, but did you all read this 2 paragraphs in your packet about thermal expansion before coming? No? I'm joking. But you know what that means? You know what that means? That means I'm going to have to lecture you about thermal expansion. Otherwise, it would be unfair of me to just ask you a question. Actually, I'm really grateful because I actually love lecturing, and I don't get to do it in my own classes anymore, so it's happy to have the opportunity here. So let's talk briefly about thermal expansion. Thermal expansion states that hard solid, like wood or steel or concrete, not soft matter, hard matter, expands when it gets hotter and contracts again when it gets colder. Very important in engineering, right? If you've ever been in a train at low speed, you may have heard this clickety-clack sound of the wheels when the train goes from one section of the rail to the other, because they leave a little gap between the sections. You may wonder, why do they leave this little gap? If they put them together, it would be a much more comfortable ride. Well, if they did that and the weather would heat up, bad things would happen. The rail would buckle because there's no space to expand. Next time you park your car in a big parking lot near an airport or near an office, after closing your car and walking away, look down. You'll see that every 10, 15 yards, there's a gap in the concrete that is filled with rubber. They put these concrete plates down, leave space for the concrete to expand, and they put rubber in there so that, water and so on doesn't go down, which can take this compression. Your dentist, when he or she fills a cavity, puts in a mixture of material, amalgam, which expands the same way that the material that a tooth is made of expands. If that were not the case, you'd have a big, big problem each time you drink some coffee, because your filling would expand more than the tooth and crack the tooth. So, you may think that it's an academic subject, but it actually affects your daily life. Now, hard solids expand because they're made from atoms that hold each other in space. I've shown 9 of them here. So they hold each other in the same arrangement, and atoms get further away from each other when it gets hotter. So this is cold, and that is hot. Cold and hot. And it's not just the 9 atoms that I've shown there, right? A real material will have millions of billions of atoms. It's all of them getting further away from each other. Now, you may wonder, this is all that I'm going to ask you about. You may wonder, why is it that atoms get further away from each other? I won't ask you this, but let me explain it to you. It's because atoms don't sit still. They vibrate. And the amplitude of that vibration, or the energy associated with it, which is the amplitude, is related to what we call temperature. So these are cold atoms, and these are hot atoms. Cold atoms, hot atoms. So imagine you were an atom. You wouldn't just sit like this. You'd be actually shaking back and forth. And as it gets hotter in this room, you shake over a bigger amplitude, and you need more space. So you can't be packed together as much. You basically push all your neighbors away, which is exactly what the atoms do. Cold and hot. Questions, anyone? Thank you for reaffirming that I'm such a great lecturer, you know. But you know, I am not simply going to hide this screen and ask you the question, when solids get hotter, they expand because A, the atoms get further away from each other, B, stay the same distance, C, get close together. That would be simply me delivering information to you and you delivering that same information to me. I'm going to see if you can take this idea of atoms getting further away from each other, all of them, and apply that to a different context. So you better ask me questions. I think there was a question there somewhere. No? Yes? Oh, that's a good question. Usually it takes a while before an audience come up with it. What about that middle one there? You see, it doesn't move. I'm going to give you an honest answer, but you're not going to like my answer. The reason the middle one is not moving is I made 2 drawings in Adobe Illustrator, actually. That's not relevant, I'm just telling you. I made these 2 drawings. This drawing, cold, and that drawing, hot, and then I slapped the 2 on top of each other, putting the middle atom on top of the middle atom. That's why the middle atom doesn't move. Seriously. Now, there was a choice. It's just not funny at all. I told you I was going to give you an honest answer. There was a choice, right? Instead of putting this black atom on top of the gray atom underneath, I could have taken this black atom and put it there, right? That would have been another choice. And in that case, you would have asked me, why is the one in the top left not moving? If I had done that, what would have happened to this atom? It would have gone down and to the right. What would have happened to this atom? Instead of going up, it would have gone to the right, and so on. What matters is not the position of an individual atom, it's the fact that they all get further away from each other. No matter what choice I'd made, even if I'd made it in such a way that no atom would have overlapped, they would still have all be further away from each other. Remember, in a real solid, there are not 9 atoms, there are not 9 million atoms, there are 9 billion atoms, there are 9 billion atoms. No, there are a lot more of them. And so the position of any individual atom doesn't even matter. Very, very good question. I think you're ready for my question, right? Okay, so listen to this. I'm going to ask you the question. I do not want you to talk to your neighbor until I tell you to. If I see anybody talk, I'll come down and I'll ask you to tell the whole room what you just told your neighbor out of fairness, okay? So then I'm going to ask you to commit yourself by using our makeup clickers here, and then find somebody who has a different answer. Instructions clear? Okay. There's not much enthusiasm here. Instructions clear? Okay, good, good. So here we go. Consider a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole in it. Imagine we take one of these plates, we put it in the oven, we turn up the temperature, the plate expands, and the diameter of the hole will, A, or 1, increase, 2, stay the same, 3, decrease. Sorry, too late to ask questions now. Who wants more time to think? Just wave at me discreetly. If you want more, it's quite all right. Just wave at me if you want more time to think. Okay, a few people. And if you've already made up your mind, ask yourself, how am I going to convince somebody who has a different answer that I'm right? Okay, well, in the interest of time, and we're going to start polling you. So don't worry, nothing depends on the answer you give. Your salary will not be affected. Your position is secure. I will not tell anybody what you answered. At the count of 3, oh, by the way, you must choose an answer. If you don't know yet, make it a game, okay? 1, 2, and 3. Okay, hold it there for a second so I can see. Okay, answers cluster, so some of you may have to get to a different table. Don't assume that if your entire table is the same answer, you're right, okay? Or don't even assume that you're right if you're talking to a physicist, because I've seen many physicists. Find a neighbor who has a different answer. Go ahead. Look at that! You all got fired up! You all got fired up. Hello? It's okay. Hello? Look at there. Hello? Madam? Hello? It's okay. It's okay. I bet that by now many of you have completely forgotten that I'm not here to talk about metal plates with circular holes in it. I'm here to talk about pedagogy. The answer to this question doesn't matter. You've already made my point. Look at the engagement there. I beg your pardon? Which answer? I don't know. I'd have to do the experiment to find the answer. Imagine for a moment that I'd given you exactly that same little lecture that I just a moment ago, but instead of asking you the question, I would have said, let's now apply this to metal plates with circular holes in it. If you take one of these plates and you put it in the oven and you turn up the temperature, the plate expands and the diameter of the hole will, I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer. You would have been sleeping through it. I mean, what is more boring than rectangular metal plates with circular holes in it? Now, isn't it amazing how you can reawaken the curiosity of the human mind? Because, whether you realize that or not, everyone is born a scientist. We're all born with an inquisitive mind. We're all born wanting to understand the world around us. Look at small children. They keep asking, why? And in a sense, it's a sad fact that education does a very, very good job turning that innate desire to learn off. And by the time we get them in higher education, they're no longer asking why. Give me the answer so I can pass the test. The good news is I've just shown you how easy it is to turn that innate curiosity back on. And trust me, if you can do it with metal plates with circular holes in it, you can do it with anything. Now, before I tell you the answer, let's analyze what happened here. I asked you a question, you thought about it, and then I had you make a commitment. You had to put your hand on your chest. And when I use clickers, I have students push a button. And after you made that commitment, I had you externalize your answer. Not to me, but to somebody near you. And something interesting happened. I didn't come and listen in, but I could see it from the way you were gesticulating. Many of you were doing this. Because what happened is that you moved from the fact, the answer, to the reasoning. It was no longer about the answer. It was about the reasoning. This brings the thinking and the reasoning back in the classroom. But most importantly, you became emotionally invested in the learning process. If I was telling you now, I'm tired, let's have the reception now. You'd come running after me asking, what's the answer to this question? Now, before I can tell you the answer, you need to vote a second time, because I need to know, how many of you changed your mind. So at the count of 3, indicate what you now believe to be the right answer. If you haven't changed your mind, you vote the same thing. If you change your mind, you indicate what you now think is the right answer. At the count of 3, 1, 2, and 3. You know, I thought I gave a pretty clear lecture. And so did you. Less than 30% of you got it right the first time. And you know, this method doesn't work that well when there's less than 30%. You should really have done your reading before coming to my... You know, in a sense, you've made a very important point, which is the point of my talk. Because you've been telling me, by the way you voted, Eric, your lecturing sucks. Which is actually precisely what I want to point out. You may have thought that you understood it, but in reality, you have not even begun to learn. So let me tell you what the right answer is. The right answer, look at that, everybody's looking at me. There's not one person tweeting or texting. It's just fantastic. I mean, could I have a drum roll? The right answer is number 1. Hey, hello. It's okay. I'm not here to talk about thermal expansion. But I don't want you to lie in bed tonight at 2 a.m. So let me take another minute, and then I'll start wrapping up pretty quickly. I want to talk about one other little aspect of education, but let me quickly take a minute here to explain this to you. Suppose you have a jar of marmalade in the refrigerator. Glass jar, metal lid. The metal lid is a ring and a plate. You take it out of the refrigerator, you can't open it. What do? You run the lid under hot water. The ring expands, the hole gets larger. You say, you didn't ask about a jar, you asked about... Okay, so let's imagine we have a metal plate, no hole in it. Metal plate, no hole. We take a marker and we draw a circle. So now we have a plate with a circle on it. Can you imagine that? We put the plate with the circle in the oven, we turn up the temperature, the plate expands. What happens to the diameter of the circle? It gets larger, everything gets larger. You say, that's unfair. There's no hole. If there was a hole, then the atoms would expand into the hole. I saw whole tables that had 3. Let me show you what's wrong with that. Let's imagine we go outside there later with, in small groups, and we hold hands, forming a circle. Each of us is an atom at the edge of the hole. Can you imagine that? Okay, holding hands, each dot is one of us, okay? Now we step in towards the center of the circle. What just happened to the distance between us? It got smaller. It can't get smaller because we're shaking more, we need more space. The only way to make more space is to remove a few of us, but atoms don't disappear like that, or to make the hole larger. Okay, and trust me, if you can do this with metal plates and circular holes, anything you want to do. Back to peer instruction, I showed right away, the first year, a doubling in the learning gains, not 20% or so, or 30, no, a doubling, 100% more. And over the years, as I perfected the approach and developed better questions to ask in class, it tripled the learning gains. And a study at Carnegie Mellon showed much better retention. So here's the learning gain with a lecture method on the left, same teacher, me, and on the right was peer instruction, the approach that I just demonstrated to you. So essentially, that was the genesis, if you want, of the flipped classroom model, although there's a lot of, a lot of disagreement about what exactly the flipped classroom is. But in a sense, rather than doing the first exposure in the class and then sending the students to their dorm rooms to, on their own, get a deeper understanding, I'd inverted that process. Let's give the students the responsibility for the first exposure, and then in class, through questioning, we create a deeper understanding, which we've just done. And I had shoved this first step out under the rug. I want to take the last 5 minutes to talk briefly about how do you get students prepared in an adequate way for this approach. Initially, I thought, you know, how do I do this? I had already recorded my lectures, so why not just have them watch video? Video has an advantage, right? I mean, in a lecture, have you ever had a student raise his or her hand and then ask, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think." Never happened in my class, but with video, you could do that, right? You could pause the video and think. Turns out, however, that students do the opposite. They do the opposite. They put the playback speed on 1.5 or 2.0, trying to get through it as fast as they can. The other thing is the viewer is passive. You're just as passive watching a video on the screen as you are in a lecture hall. And if you look at the data from edX and others, video delivery, you see that towards the end of the semester, students don't even watch anymore. They simply answer the multiple choice question guessing, which hold them accountable, which is the whole problem. There is no real accountability. And lastly, and this is perhaps the most important thing, it's an isolated individual experience, the student and the video. Whereas learning, deep down, is a social experience. So by having students watch videos, we're simply moving this out of the classroom so we don't see it, which doesn't mean it's not happening. So then I thought, let's have them read books, which have an advantage because now you're in control. If you read a book and your mind starts wandering, you stop reading because you can't do the two at the same time. So at least you're in control. And the brain is much more active during reading than during watching. But it's still an isolated individual experience, you and the book. And how do I know that my students actually read the book before coming to class? What we really want is every student prepared for every class. And this is something that I've sort of been grappling with the last few years. And because, you know, I don't know about you, but ideally I don't want to put in more effort. And then 5 years ago, suddenly, you know, a light bulb went on. You know, and it's strange that it took me so long to think about that. Let's turn the out-of-class component also into a social interaction. I'd worked hard on making the classroom a more social interaction. Let's do the same thing for the out-of-class component. So we developed a platform, which is free. You can use it without cost, with which we can actually guarantee every student prepared for every class. At its heart, it's a social learning platform. You log in through your preferred social network, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and then it shows the text for the class. If it's a textbook, then the students need to buy access through the publisher to the textbook, but it's an e-book, so it's cheaper than a printed book. If it's a PDF that's free, you know, then nobody needs to pay anything. After you log in, you can see who's online. You see their avatar from their social platform. And as you read, if you don't understand something, you can highlight something, which then opens a chat window that looks like the chat on Facebook or on your smartphone. And you can type in a question, and when you hit return, it sticks to the text. So after a while, a page will be marked up, as you see here, and you can click on a highlight, and it opens a transcript of the chat that went on there. Let's blow this up a little bit. Here's one student who, on October 20th, asked, "I don't understand how this combination of factors tells you blah, blah, blah," and so on. 30 minutes later, another student says, "I think you may be able to think about the direction separately," and so on. 2 days later, a third student here comes in and says, "This is a great question," to further elaborate. So what you see here is, in a sense, asynchronous peer instruction, the students helping each other parse the more difficult parts of the text. So how do you get students to participate? Well, ideally, I'd like to do it completely through intrinsic motivation, but so much of education is driven by extrinsic motivation that it became clear that we had to use some kind of combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation drivers. So there's a rubric-based assessment If you go into perusal, you can download the rubric. Essentially, we tell the students that their annotations must demonstrate thoughtful reading and interpretation of the text. So if all you do is highlight things and you say, I don't understand this, sorry, no credit. If you highlight something and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 you get partial credit. If you highlight something and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 and I thought that, and you reveal your thinking, you get full credit. We want, of course, not just one annotation, but a certain number of them. They need to be before class. I mean, you can enter them after class too, but in order to get credit, before class. And we want them to be distributed. Initially, we saw that students were all too happy to annotate the first 2 pages of a 20-page chapter and then call it a day. So with that simple rubric, in my class, which has 60 students, I get 20,000 annotations. 20,000. The students write more text than the author of the textbook has written. So I can already hear you think, how do you process all of that? Well, I got together with a colleague who is a quantitative social scientist who does machine learning analysis of social media. And I was interested in his work because I realized that these annotations were very similar to a tweet or a Facebook post. And the computer is very good at systematically analyzing large numbers of data. The human mind is very good at analyzing a few things very accurately, but gets tired very quickly. So we adapted that machine learning algorithm, and I'm very proud to tell you that it actually exceeds intercoder reliability. You know, it's partially subjective, of course, the judging of effort and thoughtful reading. The machine does as well as the human being who has trained it, better than another person can reproduce that. But it gets better than that. You see, as an instructor, if I could read all of these questions, I could actually give a better class. But I don't have the patience to click on 1,000 annotations per class and read them and extract the ones that are meaningful. So we decided to develop another algorithm that would extract from all of the annotations the most burning unanswered question. So before class, you can press on a button and you get this confusion report. Here it says, you know, the 3 topics that confuse the students the most, and it has some exemplar questions. So I can go to class and I can say, thank you for your thoughtful annotations. It appears you were confused about topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, and I just have a slide that shows that. And then I say, one of you asked this really good question, cut, paste. And now I use their questions in class, connecting the out-of-class component to the in-class component. So the motivating factors are intrinsic, the social interaction, and this tie-in to the in-class activity, and then the extrinsic one is completely automated. Let me show you some stunning data, and then we'll call it an evening. This shows the number of my students, and we've done this now for a number of institutions, this analysis, because we have a lot of institutions that are using it already. And it's pretty similar for a non-Harvard institution. This shows for 3 different semesters the percentage of students versus the number of chapters that they missed reading before class. In this case, there were 15 chapters, so the graph continues, but everything is 0. 70% misses 0 chapter. They annotate every single chapter from the beginning of semester to the end of the semester. I don't know about you, but I certainly miss deadlines sometimes. You know, you can get sick, there can be other obligations and so on. So, and notice that in this last year, which was the dark one, no students missed more, maybe 1 or 2 students missed 4 chapters, but that was the worst that happened. If you let some students miss 1 or 2 chapters, put this all together, you get to 95% of the students. I think this is as close as we could possibly get to every student prepared for every class. So, you know, this was sort of the clincher, right? I mean, all of these years I'd sort of made the class more interactive, but not really had a good way of getting the students prepared for my class. But I feel that this is something that really enables this approach to teaching better than anything I have done before. So I want to end by saying that education is not just about transferring information. We have good ways of doing that now. It's not just about getting our students to do what we do. We don't know what problems our students are going to face. In fact, society faces a lot of problems. I want my students to stand on my shoulders, to solve the problems that I cannot yet solve. And therefore, we must go beyond transferring information. We must bring back higher order thinking skills in the classroom. And in order to do that, I think that active participation and social interaction are a must, not only in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. Thank you very much. So I've been informed that there are some microphones there, so we'll take a few questions, and then if there are any burning questions, and then we can continue to talk informally over the reception. The microphones are right here in the third row.
Hi, can I go ahead? Hi, I was just curious with this method you're talking about getting students to read. Can you show that it's better among students that actually read than students who just read it before? I mean, with the social interaction, you know what I mean?
So comparing what and what? I'm sorry, I missed.
So comparing, like, in this new way where they have the additional social interaction versus if you were able to tell before, like, among students that read the textbook independently.
Well, we certainly find a high correlation between students who read. At Ohio State, where they've used this in some classes that are really large, like 600 students, they've shown that the students who read consistently perform better. I mean, which is not that surprising, right? And in a sense, the social interaction and probably also the fact that this is automatically assessed gets more students to read. And therefore, the class as a whole does better than it did before. Yeah, right.
I just wonder, can you show that? I mean, it just seems to me that that social interaction would be an additional benefit to learning as well, right? And I'm just curious if you had any data to show that. Or,
So I could do that by taking away the grading and see if just the social interaction is enough of a motivation for the students to read. I haven't had the guts to do that with my non-majors. I probably should. What I can tell you is that we can analyze when the annotations are made, and interestingly enough, you know, I think it's around 10 or 20% of the annotations. I just saw one of my co-workers present data on it, occurs after the deadline, where there's no grade incentive anymore to participate. So at least we know that it doesn't, you know, stop. It continues after class, and they continue to interact with each other. But it would be an interesting experiment to do.
Thanks.
Yes, do you have any data that shows anything about, or how many questions or how many problems that you get from students that are English as a second language or for non-traditional students?
Yeah, so, you know, of course, at Harvard, we have a very diverse population at Harvard, because of the need-blind admissions policy, but they're all, you know, sort of skimmed off the top in a sense. Around the world. So my institution would not be the best place to do that study. However, one of my postdocs, one of my graduate students wrote her thesis about looking at underrepresented minorities and gender differences and found that the interaction in the classroom actually helped female students disproportionately. They come in with a gender gap, but the gender gap is closed towards the end of the semester when you teach this way. Whereas when I taught a traditional class, the gender gap simply translated up. It also helps minorities, except that our data that we have there are not as, you know, solid, I would say, as the one on gender. A colleague of mine at a community college in Canada sort of replicated some of the studies we've done at Harvard to look how it helps students with, you know, persistence in STEM disciplines. How many students, I never looked at that because we don't have that much of a dropout at Harvard, and it shows that if you implement interactive teaching, even in just one course, students are twice as likely to stay in STEM disciplines than if they don't have this interactive experience. And I'm happy to point you in the direction of more data if later, because I think it's very important that we collect data about this, not just anecdotes. As I think Lee Schulman of the Carnegie Foundation once says, the plural of anecdote is not data.
So I noticed that the question you gave us for an example of a peer instruction in lecture question was framed in a very simple way, no jargon, no calculations, so we certainly could all clearly understand the question. And when I think of questions I would want to use in my class in that way, I quickly think of more complicated questions. So I was wondering if there's, if for the peer instruction to be as effective as ideally it would be, is there a limit to how you can phrase questions or set them up? Are there some types of questions that don't work as well?
So what do you teach, if I may ask?
Biology, genetics.
Biology, genetics. You know, and I'm sure that even, but still for undergraduates or a graduate course?
Undergraduates.
Graduate course.
Freshmen, sophomores.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, there are misconceptions that persist a long time. I'm sure you're aware of a movie that one of my colleagues at the Smithsonian made, Minds of Their Own. Have you ever seen that? Okay, it's worse. You may want to Google it later. Minds of Their Own. So Phil Sadler is the PI on that project. Essentially, at graduation at Harvard and MIT, he went around campus, everybody in their graduation gowns. And he asked simple conceptual questions, not one on genetics, but there's one on biology, the others on circuit. I'll tell you the one from biology or maybe biochemistry. Basically, the interviewer placed in the hand of, and he did this probably with 20 or so different students, even faculty, a seed, and then said, from this seed, a tree can grow. And they had conveniently a log handy. So the next thing is they put in the arms of the student who's being interviewed a log, saying, this log is from a tree that grew out of a seed like this. Where did all this stuff come from? And these very articulate and well-dressed Harvard graduates and MIT graduates says, well, from the soil, the nutrients in the soil, and the water, and this and that. And then the interviewer says, well, what if I were to tell you this comes from the carbon dioxide in the air? They know all about photosynthesis, by the way, but not applied to the real world, I guess. And they look at the interviewer and they say, no. Carbon dioxide is light, and this is heavy, right? It's amazing. It's absolutely stunning. In a sense, it's the same thing that happened in my class with a student asking me, how should I answer these questions? And I think that, even at the graduate level, we see people who have some very basic misconceptions that have never been addressed, and that we have become unaware of because we never probe at that level. And for us, it was such a long time that we struggled with it that we've forgotten about it. So the first step is really to find out if your students have any deep misconceptions. Sometimes they come, in an oral examination, or you uncover those very fundamental holes in people's knowledge. So I would say this probably has a place at every level. And listening is probably not the best way to learn. You learn by doing, right? If let's say you want to learn to play the piano, you don't go to a concert hall listening to famous pianists play. You have to play. If you want to train for a marathon, you don't sit in front of the TV eating popcorn, watching DVDs of marathon runners. You got to run. If you want to learn biology or physics, you don't learn it by just watching somebody talk about biology. You got to actually do biology. And in a sense, I think teaching by questioning puts students in a position of trying out their reasoning.
My name is Agashi. I teach mathematics at Wesley College, undergraduate. The first thing I want to say is thank you for sharing this information with us. It addresses the main challenges of interactive learning. It's not that we don't know that it is good to teach by interaction, but there are usually challenges getting the student to do the things you want them to do before they interact with you. You seem to have addressed that very well. My question is the software you're talking about affordable? How much does it cost?
It's free. Just go to perusal.com. It's free. If you want to use a textbook, then the students need to buy the textbook from the publishers through Perusal, but otherwise it's free. It's free. By the way, thank you for that compliment. That reminded me of something. I told you that students accused me of lecturing for my lecture notes early in my career. I have taken care of that. That never happens anymore. You know what they say now in the end of semester evaluation? Professor Mazur is not teaching us anything. We have to learn it all ourselves. How much time do I have? Okay, so we'll take 2 more questions, and then I will talk 3 more questions. Okay.
I have a question from the other aspect of Perusal, which is, as a textbook writer, do you have any thoughts about how to write better textbooks, especially in this context, right? So what makes for a good interactive textbook?
I just finished writing a textbook, and I used Perusal to optimize the version, and let me tell you, a lot of things that I'd written that I thought were perfectly clear caused the most confusion, and there's no way of finding out until you see what students write. So you'll be looking at their annotation, you go, oh, that's how they interpret what I've written. So it's a great tool to improve your manuscript.
Very good.
And the clarity of your writing.
Are there data on what fraction of student misconceptions can be fully resolved through peer instruction as opposed to requiring some kind of expert piping in?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I don't think so, and I think that, we're probably not even aware of all of the misconceptions that are there, right? And also, when you do a set of questions addressing a misconception, let's say the misconception that was there about the metal expanding into the hole, right? I'm sure that we haven't resolved it for everybody, and there's still some people going to come to me during the reception asking me, what if some atoms go in and other atoms go? I mean, I have that always happen. So I would say, even with peer instruction, it would be an illusion to think that we've addressed all of the misconception. The fact, however, is that the data show 2 things. I've only shown one, that there is a higher learning gain on conceptual surveys. Data that I did not show that students do better on traditional exams, even though there's been less training on traditional exams. And lots of other data too, but I don't have time to go into all those details. Good. Let's see. And then I think okay.
Mine's very quick. If the Perusal is free, does that mean that the software that does the grading also comes free?
Yes, because it's simply an algorithm.
Oh, good.
There's no human being.
Good.
It's based on a machine learning algorithm that was actually developed originally to analyze social media. We can talk about it more. I can tell you about it. And in a couple of languages, we've developed a machine learning algorithm. So if the language that you're using is not English, check with me first before you start using it. Because it is language dependent. It's not very much subject dependent, but it is very strongly, of course, language dependent.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Mazur for his excellent presentation. That concludes our formal agenda for this evening. Please join us for the reception, which is being held nearby. And we will reconvene in the morning. Thank you.